right.
Cool, great.
So, Jeffrey Hull, it's so great to have you here today.
It's great to be here today. Thank you for the invitation.
I know, we've already started our summer here at the University of the Pacific.
And it's flying by.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
You and I were together last week. We did a national equity summit in the academic experience with Georgetown University being the lead institution.
Yeah, for the Equity Institute. So great to have the team together from the University of Pacific, and I met people I really haven't worked with before. So extraordinary work, Mary. Thank you.
Absolutely. So here at the University of the Pacific, we happen to have one of our own in the studio today. And I'd like to introduce the audience to my friend and colleague, Professor Jeffrey Hull. I'm going to talk a little bit about you so that everybody knows something about you, okay?
Okay.
As we begin, our conversation today on humanizing us. So, Jeffrey, you're an associate professor here at the university in the English department.
That's right.
PhD. And master's degree in English, and even your undergraduate bachelor's degree was both in English and Spanish.
That's right, right.
Part of your work, which I really love, is that you're the director of the Humanities Scholar program and the director of the PAL Scholars program. In many ways, you're dealing with students who I would say are interested in critical inquiry.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is a piece that you have in your bio that I want to share with the audience. My underlying goal is to facilitate students' growing awareness of themselves as intellectuals, people who use their minds to find connections, to read situations critically and historically, and to think about the relationship between literature and important questions that arise in the current moment. That's part of the reason why you teach.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if I may add to that, so thanks for that, that wonderful opening introduction, and even calling attention to the reason why I teach, why I think intellectual work is important, and also like why literature is important. I think that much of what I have to convey is about the importance of literature, but not literature just as something that we have to consume, right? It's not just something else that entertains us, though it can do that, and that's extraordinary and fun. For me, literature opens up worlds, other experiences. It develops a sense of empathy for others, and enters those worlds that we may not be able to enter into ourselves. And so for me, literature has opened up those worlds, even since I was a young child, right? And so trying to find a way into worlds that went far beyond my own.
So you mentioned the young child piece, and let's talk a little bit about that. I believe that identity informs formation, and our formational experiences, particularly in our early childhood, is where we can find a lot of the places that help us understand who we become or who we're becoming today. So a lot of the work that I do as a social justice educator is that I am always interested in the early formation experiences of my colleagues and leaders and change makers. But I like to poke at the early formation experiences, particularly around identity.
Right.
And because, race is the area that I like to look and do critical inquiry from. I'm interested in identity and the intersection of race and other identities, social identities that are clues to help me understand and to help others understand how people show up in the world today. So, Jeffrey, tell us a little bit about your early formation experiences.
Okay, well that's
particularly at the intersection of identity and race.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I love this question too, Mary, because it's not something that I think, especially in faculty, as faculty members in academia, we get to talk about that often. Perhaps we can, but and yet we bring that to bear in ways that we're not even conscious of in the classroom, how we interact with our colleagues, how we interact with students. So thank you for that, but also like, oh my, what am I going to talk about here, right? So no, it's great. In some ways, my parents were working class, so I have a better sense of a sort of a class consciousness growing up. Even I remember being involved in thinking about politics early on as a child, right, in ways that perhaps others aren't, and in a way that I was really aware of difference from that particular perspective. And I think that allowed me and opened up a way for me to think about difference from all the different kinds of intersections you're asking about today. And again, not that one knows that or experiences those, but there's an opening with the possibility of empathy, but also recognizing from where one comes to think that we're differently situated, our histories are different, and yet they're all kind of bound up in these historical forces that we call America, or global politics, or modern economies, and we're situated in that way that's really, yeah.
So you mentioned class.
Yeah.
So let's talk about class a little bit. How did your class formulate who you become, who you are?
Yeah.
What's the intersection of class for you?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And so, like I mentioned before, my parents are working class. My father worked in manufacturing for a number of years, in fact, for most of his life. My mom, cleaned houses and did a lot of work that people don't necessarily want to do. And I think I saw what it means to be on that side, right? And what it means to to be in that part of an economy, I guess, but also what that meant, especially in the 80s when I was growing up under Reaganism. Like how that.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. You said your mother cleaned houses, so your mom was a domestic worker.
Yeah, I mean, we have all these vocabularies now for talking about these things.
Yes.
In fact, you and I have talked about before that we didn't have vocabularies, we didn't have a nomenclature to analyze these things until maybe even graduate school, right? Where like, oh my God, we're reading critical theory, we're looking at histories, we're thinking about race and class in ways that we were kind of thinking about before and had a grasp on, but we're not able to conceptualize fully, articulate fully, or think as historically as we can now.
Absolutely. So you come from a family where your dad's a manufacturer worker and your mom also participates as a domestic worker. How did those specific class experiences inform who you became and the choices that you made?
Yeah, well, I feel like there's therapy going on here right now, too. I just suppress all that, really don't. No, these are really good. Really good. I think that in some ways, first of all, it informed me as a person and how I have relationships with other people. Again, it's a sense of empathy, it's a sense of compassion and caring, and I think also a real sense of social justice in the world. And we do the best that we can there. And so I think even when I was, in high school, I had a better sense of who that is because we see the differences in class, especially at that level. I mean, I grew up in an area that was predominantly white and rural, and yet there was class differences, race differences that I had to think through, learn how to process. Had relationships with people who looked different than me, who came from different backgrounds than me, who came from different class positions than me. And so I think in some ways that certainly called into question where I was coming from, but also I had to make the effort to understand where they were coming from more often than not. So I think in high school especially, my politics formed around the question of class. I certainly saw that develop as an undergraduate. I became more interested. I grew up as a Catholic too, so this working class Catholic background, and so social justice was kind of woven through in some ways my own identity formation.
Absolutely.
At least that side of the Catholic formation, and so I explored that significantly as an undergraduate, looking at what they call liberation theology and the ways in which this was all the works that were going on in Central South America in particular. But then that informed the way I think about America, about the United States, and I think there's a direct link to why I wrote and think about America and the United States in particular in the ways that I have over the last 20 years. So, and that is a critical kind of outside exilic examination of what the United States does in the world, both to its people internally and to those externally. So
absolutely. So you began to hit at what I called a faith-informed social justice.
Okay. Yeah.
The Catholic social justice tenets, such as the dignity of human beings, the dignity in work, a lot of the work that has led to what would have been union work in the early United States, you know, these
Dorothy
ideas,
Day,
and Dorothy Day, and so on. So you actually come through that type of educational formation tradition.
Yeah.
Did you actually attend Catholic schools?
Yeah, up through 8th grade.
Through 8th grade.
Right, and we didn't have a Catholic school for high school, but
Okay.
yeah.
And it led you to English, the love of English and the love of literature.
Right. Yeah, even going back to high school, I found that, again, that world opened up just spaces, peoples that I could not have connected with before. And so while I love the other subjects, my best area, the part that I really began to resonate with me was within literature, right? And try to write poetry and stories, but also to read literature, to think about literature. Yeah.
So I want to share with the audience some of the research focus that you've had. Then I want to talk about your current work. Okay. I'm going to connect some of that little bit of that early formation experience to what you're doing now. So your research focuses on early and 19th century American literature, world literature, criticism and theory, which you've already shared, law and literature, U.S. empire, that's juicy, liberalism and neoliberalism. I want to point to something that you are working on now that you and I have barely begun to talk about, and I really want to start to unpack that because I think that this is quite phenomenal, but hearing a little bit about your formation experience is giving me a bit of a window to understanding how you've chosen this as a scholar and a thinker. The Fugitive Inventions, American Literature, Slavery, and the Force of Law. And you're looking at the connection between 19th century literature and the fugitive slave tactics. Tell us a little bit about what that's about.
Yeah, so in some ways, while I focus on the 19th century, this is the historian, literary critic in me, it's like you can't understand that moment unless you go back a few hundred years, right? So you and I have talked about this even at the Institute and in our conversations that you can't understand the United States. You can't understand America both as a project, as a geography, as a concept of you know, the European colonial project, unless you think about it in and through kind of the matrix of race, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I always begin and everything with race. People always wonder why.
And why?
That's the reason why.
And I think that so some of the work that I do with my students and the work that I reflect on in my own scholarship is that, you know, Columbus was the first to inaugurate the transatlantic slave trade, first by transporting native peoples back to Europe, but then quickly turning around and bringing African peoples back to the Americas. This opened up not only those trade routes where, you know, African peoples become the cargo, right? And then in some ways an extracted form of labor power throughout the Americas. So it has that economic function, but also what's important is that in moderating that and thinking about those transatlantic flows, then you need a system of law, right, to give it an order, what they call in the theoretical terms a nomos, right?
Yes.
So kind of nomos, a law, an order over that Atlantic space, but also in such a way that it begins to identify and codify within law who these different kinds of people, and I use that intentionally, different kinds of people are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you recognize them?
How do you recognize them?
You recognize them mainly by color.
Exactly. Color, phenotype.
Phenotypes.
In fact, you know, of all the differences there are within the broad spectrum of humanity, it's interesting that, you know, and this seems arbitrary at first, but like, why do we focus on, you know, like sex or gender, and then why phenotype? But these things take hold, right?
Absolutely.
And are rooted, and pretty soon they can become policed and enforced.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of what I look at is, you know, the way in which the law, and actually more importantly, how power, right? How the force of law comes into being, and how it recognizes, how it identifies, how it polices Black lives over hundreds of years until we get to the 19th century. So.
And the movement of those Black bodies as a form of property, as well as the very property that will enable, that turns to capital, because you buy and exchange this capital, and you use this capital to build the infrastructure of the economic, political, and cultural capital of what would become known as the United States of America.
Yeah, exactly.
And people wonder why race is central in everything.
Right. It's here from the very beginning. So in some ways, my formulation, my thesis, it starts with those first captives, right?
Yes.
That are slowly codified into law, recognized within law as property. In fact, there's, it takes hundreds of years to kind of figure out, is this human? Is it person? What is the personality? What is the property side of this?
Yes.
Can we baptize these folks? Can we not? But it's all done to better instrumentalize the institution of slavery.
Absolutely. I mean, it was black, when they finally got to the final conclusion that blacks were considered 3/5 of a human.
Right.
This whole thing of just trying to figure out just how human are they?
Yeah.
How much do we attribute to these human, pieces that we understand, and how much do we recognize that they're property?
Yeah,
But at the end of the
exactly.
day, they're property, and they're for the purposes of advancing capital. They are capital in and of themselves as bodies.
And I think the way you're talking about capitals are like right on the mark here too, because I think in some ways our historical understanding of economic development says there's mercantilism, and then sometime by the 18th century there was capitalism, as if there's almost a clean break with Adam Smith or something, right? And if we study slavery, and those really good historians and theorists now who are looking at slavery understand that the makings of that, I mean, in some ways slavery is central to modern capitalist development,
absolutely.
right? It almost precedes it or coincident with capitalism.
Absolutely.
So,
I think that slavery was capital.
Yeah,
it was the capital that allowed the new nation to be able to do what it needed to do in order to move forward.
Right.
So this podcast, is humanizing us.
Yeah.
I feel like we got there real quick, didn't we?
And yet I was thinking about, I didn't have much to go on today. I was thinking, I wonder what we're going to talk about today. But knowing that, we'll be here all day. But the very title, humanizing us, it's in some ways we covered it, but also like it opens up broad conversations, long conversations, humanizing us. Humanizing is if there's a preoccupation in that very category, right? That's central to all of us, those of us who are conscious enough to think about race in the United States. And
absolutely.
Not just race, but other factors, but as long as we're on the topic of race right now,
So humanizing us means that we have to decolonize ourselves.
Yeah.
Decolonizing our minds, decolonizing ourselves in ways that we don't even know.
Yeah.
I mean, here I am, I'm a black woman. I know that I'm confronted with decolonizing myself every day. I don't even know how I've been decolonized, even though I'm conscious of the ways that I have been.
Because it's, it's Fanon, right? It talks about decolonizing, right, the mind, and I think that, so it's a process too, and this is a part that in some ways is the preoccupation, the process of decolonizing, the process of humanizing. I mean, the kind of problematic that arises there that we see in our thinking is that, if we're humanizing us and we're arriving at the human, the question for me, the philosophical, theoretical one is, even ontological one is, well, where are we starting from, right? I mean, I think in some ways, are we not human yet, or where do we begin then in that process, and what does that beginning mean, right? So I was thinking about this as I was walking over today, humanizing us. I mean, it's two terms, two categories, but just loaded and fraught with historical, theoretical questions that I feel like we could unpack that over a semester with students or through a book, right, that we're writing. And anyway, those are just thoughts that I had about your title, which I both admire and I'm scared of.
Well, this is the work of our lifetime. And we just get to do it while we are able to be here and advance it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So tell me a little bit about how you define diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those three words together that are DEI.
Right.
At a time like this.
Yeah, we were talking about this. In fact, I feel like this is a follow-up conversation, not just a conversation, because there's something kind of surface about a conversation, but an in-depth examination or an interrogation of some of these categories in ways that they may have been deployed conveniently, or even commodified in ways that you and I had talked about before. And so I think the real intellectual work, the real political work, the real social justice work is actually continuing to push on those categories to see where they're adequate or inadequate. And this is why I really admire the work that our team was doing at the Institute a week ago and thinking about anti-racism, right? Because I think in some ways there's a provocation with that, in some ways that maybe diversity, equity, inclusion doesn't always provoke.
Absolutely.
Right? And but then to tie anti-racism, social justice to these other categories that are sometimes more readily digested or consumed by a broader public, right? Because it sounds nice and it sounds nice, right? But there's real work to be done in these when we really push on those categories.
And what you're getting at is the commodification of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because once anything goes out into the cultural ethos, the way the construction of how this country has worked, the white supremacist context always capitalizes it and commodifies it.
Yeah.
And so what do social justice educators, thinkers, doers, activists, how do you continue to move this work forward, DEI, within an environment which seeks to commodify even the very thing that's seeking to disrupt and make change?
That's a really good question. In fact, I was thinking about this. I'm thinking about this as well too, and kind of coming to this sense that, in the kind of work that we're doing, it's almost as if that strategy, those tactics, those attempts to call into question the status quo get absorbed by the very thing that we're trying to dismantle or reconstitute, right? And so you and I talked about the quotidian, the everyday work. I mean, Desserteau talks about the practices of everyday life. I believe Desserteau was a Jesuit too, wasn't he? So,
I think so.
That's kind of interesting. But,
and I worked for the Jesuits for 13 years.
That's right. We both have interesting histories there.
Yeah, and it all weaves in.
So the everyday work, has to be done so that it doesn't readily get absorbed, to get extracted, to get commodified. And though it does, right? But that is, I think, the continuation of that project, the effort of the everyday work that has to be done. Now that's somewhat abstract, but your question is getting at, well, how do we actually do that? What does that work look like?
You're an educator.
Yeah.
You do it in the classroom.
I think so. I think we do it in the classroom, and for me, that sense of the classroom is expanding now too. I think for other reasons, because higher education, like many other institutions, and the forms of real equity, social mobility, real social justice that's been done within that institution can also be readily commodified or at least absorbed or extracted in such a way that it becomes more and more difficult to do that.
Absolutely.
Institutions are under greater and greater pressure to stay afloat, right? I mean, they're tied in with finance capital.
We have real market pressures.
Market pressures. And so how do you balance that or stay afloat within those kinds of conditions and continue to do the work that is absolutely necessary for everyone and for the human race, right?
And you know how you're doing it? Because it's how I do it. We invest in people.
We
invest in our students.
Exactly.
And we do it by seeing the brilliance that they bring and the ways that they're trying to disrupt, sometimes dismantle, and help prepare them with the tools that they'll need as they go forth. They need to be grounded in an interdisciplinary education that is based upon humanism.
I think you're absolutely right. And I like the way that you turn there as well from, yes, we're talking about those who educate and what they sort of impart to the next generation. But I have to tell you, and this is really just kind of calling forth what you've just put forth, that they're really challenging us too.
Absolutely.
They're pushing back constantly.
That's the reason why I love this age group. I've always loved this age group. Actually, I love high schoolers and college students. But you know what another really brilliant group is?
Fifth graders?
Fifth graders. I knew you were going to say that. Fifth graders are brilliant.
They are. I know.
They're disruptors.
They are. They call into question. They're philosophers.
They're philosophers. They're poets.
They have intellect at that age, that language. So
there's some real sweet age groups.
Yeah, there are.
Fifth grade is a sweet, educationally. If you want to change the world, you can change the world with a group of fifth graders.
And then they go through adolescence, and there's all this neural pruning going on and stuff.
But then we get them when they come to college, and that's we've both committed our lives to that particular age group.
Yeah.
And by the time they come to us, they're fully formed, in regard to that early formation. And so they bring all their histories, the cultural ways of knowing and being, and their different ways of understanding how life works. And then they interact it with some of the materials we bring them and introduce them to in the world. And then there's this kind of mutual, beneficial exchange that happens.
Yeah. And sparks fly in that moment too. And I mean, just light bulbs turning on, but they put things together that they weren't able to put together before. Just as you and I were talking about our own formations, our own histories, that we didn't necessarily have critical vocabularies to talk about our past experiences, but they, sometimes we give them those tools, those histories, those critical terms, and then they are able to put that in context with their own knowledge, their own histories, their own experiences, and something new comes out of that. And I feel like that's where they continue to challenge institutional habits, types of pedagogy that we engage in, but also the ways that we think. In fact, one sort of like sub-theme of my work and my teaching is that I often give students some histories and backgrounds on student activism. We think about Berkeley, we think about the 60s, but I want them to think about their own present moment, because there are a lot of myths out there now about the current generation, right? Usually from boomers and others that really have absorbed and have the most privilege right now, culturally, historically, materially. And so this generation is extraordinary to me in terms of the types of pressures that they face, the types of questions that they're going to have to answer, the types of conditions that they're living in with now. So from student debt to environmental catastrophe to geopolitics. So they're up against a lot right now, and so they have to challenge us, I think.
They do. Yeah. They do. So for a number of years, I taught for the School of Management, School of Business. I taught graduate students, particularly MBA students, and I was the one that came in to help them to think about these things that we're talking about. I was a social justice educator in an MBA program. How do you like that?
That's awesome.
It was a lot of fun, actually. And most of it, I coached it in a way that I thought that was helpful to them, and I would really talk about their leadership, of who they would become sitting around a board table, how they should occupy a space. And I try to introduce them to these concepts of equity and how it shows up in a for-profit context, and give them some tools, some social justice tools, racial equity, and things that were not part of the nomenclature of a corporate environment. But I wanted my MBA students to be the ones that would like drop the bomb and set things right. When you think about leadership, your leadership, you're academician, you're a scholar, and you are advancing the work in your field as both an English scholar, but thinking about your work. But you're also a leader. You're an academic leader. It's clear to me that you're an academic leader.
Thank you. Yeah.
Your identity, how you engage your critical inquiry, and your leadership. Talk to me about your leadership and how your leadership will continue to be formed by all those things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Something I have been thinking about for a long time, I think. I think that partly because I feel like we're modeling all the time in ways we don't even register. And our students are picking up on that in ways that they may not even understand at that time. And so as in front of the classroom, certainly it's a leadership position, but I feel like good leaders are thinking about solving problems, and so in some ways we become partners with our students who are also facing extraordinary challenges at this moment in history. And so I think for me, how I communicate, how I allow other students especially and other colleagues to shape me is really important to leadership. And sort of turns leadership kind of around in a moment. Sometimes we think of leadership as the one who's at the very head of the class or at the head of the boardroom meeting or something. And I think that this is a challenge for everyone, especially a challenge for me because I like to talk, but to learn how to listen, right? To learn how to listen. And so I think the more that I listen, the better person I become. The better person I become, the better leader I can be.
Yeah.
And I think that, when I listen to my students, it's like they have real wisdom to share. And I think that's true not just my students, but when we were at the Institute this last week, what I found was just, an extraordinary wealth of knowledge and wisdom from our colleagues, and colleagues I don't get a chance to visit with or share with all the time. And so I think that, listening is certainly important to an ethos that I want to continue to develop and work on as a person. And so listening is like really listening. I don't know if that makes sense, but like
to listen.
Yeah, to really listen.
To listen well, we have to be more vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because to be more vulnerable means that we have to like set ourselves aside and not to center ourselves.
Yeah.
Talk to me about where you see your own vulnerability showing up in the classroom and in the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways that there's a lot of historical pressure that if you're the professor, you're up there professing.
Well, academia is one of the most classist organizations.
We are. I mean,
we kind of created classism.
We did,
ourselves.
And the institution of higher education is built on a meritocratic system as well, and so we still think about that.
We think about that.
It shapes who we think we are, our identity right now, and where we are in the pecking order. And I mean, there's a lot of damage that comes with that. There's a lot of violence that's meted out because of that.
Absolutely.
And we participate in it sometimes unwittingly.
Yeah.
And so I think being aware of that, again, as a person, as humanizing us to be more human, is to recognize how the institutions that we love and support are also really damaging to people and probably have damaged us in many ways.
Absolutely.
And so I love the way you put that, calling attention to that and having the ability to be reflexive and to self-reflect on how we are either perpetuating it, I think these are your terms too, Mary, promoting it, as you say, or somehow halting it, calling it a question, going in a different direction with this.
Yeah.
And by that, I don't mean to be too abstract, but that is, what does the classroom look like when we, as you say, decenter ourselves from that?
Yeah.
So it's not, just some new pedagogical, smoke and mirrors. This is like real material, spatial change that can happen within that moment.
People talk about anti-racism. Anti-racism is radical.
Yeah.
That's what Professor Kendi calls it.
Exactly.
He says anybody that wants to do anti-racism work or wants to be anti-racist, they need to understand that it goes in the complete opposite direction of everything that this country has stood for and been constructed on.
Yep.
And so we use the word kind of loosely and kind of lightly and not recognizing that there's real power if we choose to do the active work of becoming anti-racist as an individual or anti-racist as a department or anti-racist as a company or anti-racist as a university.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, I think that self-reflection is like really, really important. And self-reflection in the sense that you need to reflect on yourself as a person, as a human, but also reflect on, again, these habits that we're ingrained in performing every day, again, within our departments, within our classrooms, within institutions, that we're not aware of, right?
Yeah.
And so that radical work, and I think this also goes back to what we were talking about before, that is when we really begin to think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and we reinfuse that with the radicality that you're talking about, then it has some real power, right? But again, that's the everyday work of it. But I think that you're right, to talk about Ibram Kendi's work, in your own work here, in our own work, to forget that it is radical is to do it a major disservice and to perpetuate the very things that we say we're trying to tackle here. So, that's good. Good stuff.
I'm having such a good time having this conversation with you.
Yeah.
So I have just a couple more questions for you.
Okay, I want to get back to the boardroom experience too.
Yes.
Because you're talking about, I think in some ways, whether we like it or not, these types of institutions, higher education, corporate culture, these, these are institutions that we're all in some ways imbricated in, right? So I'm curious to hear more.
And implicated in it.
Exactly, yeah.
We're implicated in different ways based upon.
Co-conspirators with it.
We're co-conspirators and our identities.
Yeah, precisely.
Both the identity formation, which is where I always begin my work.
Yeah.
And then the identity construction, and then the way that we play that out.
So it's just curious to me because I've never been necessarily in a corporate environment. I mean, most of my work and my life has been in academia. So how does one go about engaging in that particular kind of culture, that kind of meritocracy of its own?
Well, you know what? I think the meritocracy is prevalent. You know, we know it's everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, our entire system is based upon this notion of merit, and but it's this individual, rugged notion of merit that ties back to the manifest destiny and some of the things you talked about earlier. So when we think about this ideas of identity, making it, mattering, pulling oneself up by their own bootstrap, we oftentimes forget that one needs to have a boot in order to pull up, and then one needs to have a strap that's tied to the boot to be able to pull up. But we overlook all that critical inquiry, which is the work that's what DEI work is.
Right.
It's critical inquiry. Is to think about those spaces and those things, and we immediately run over to the triumph of the individual and what the individual has triumphed, particularly in the land of the home and of free and brave, and anybody can do it.
That's it. I think last time you were talking about this in the sense
but can
of
anybody do
individual exceptionalism, right?
Yes.
And so I think that both higher education and let's say corporate culture, like generally, I'm sure there are differences within these different corporations per se.
Oh, my earring's
but that
falling
is, that is, there's still within these different kinds of institutions, within these cultural practices, something that says, if you don't make it as an individual, it's your fault, right? So, and this goes back to, I think, my own early formation, knew that's not true at all, right? I mean, some don't have boots, some don't have straps. And so I think that, both of our perspectives, I'll speak for myself, was in ways I couldn't have articulated early on in my life, an ability to see how systems work or don't work, how systems oppress, or how systems can help people, or they can continue to keep people in their place.
I say that all systems either propel people or they impede people, and there's usually no neutrality. Either a system is going to help move you forward, or it is going to impede you.
That's right.
And our work is to understand what are those systems that are in place. So I want to talk to you a little bit about your own, you mentioned mindfulness. We call it critical consciousness in my field. You know that.
Okay.
So critical, and in Catholic education, they may call it critical reflection, different people call it different things, but it's all the same. This idea of becoming critically engaged with information, one's own histories, one's own history in relation to others' histories, the histories of around you, so that you can make sense, make meaning, and then make, hopefully, more positive, inclusive, equitable social change.
Right.
What's your thoughts on that? Critical consciousness. How do you go about creating critical consciousness every day?
Well, it is the everyday, I think. In fact, I think that, we've talked about living in this moment. It's easier to be a consumer. In fact, everything is lined up from the devices that we watch to the information to the commercials that are there before us to make us comfortable, to make it convenient, to make us good consumers. So, these are psychologically sort of tailored and algorithmically designed to make sure that our brains stay that way, so that we do consume, that we participate unwittingly or wittingly within this kind of consumer culture. And so this isn't just in some ways a criticism of consumer culture, but that seems to me in some ways antithetical to what we call like mindfulness. Like how do we act in the world? How do our actions affect other people? How is it that what I consume and also throw away have reverberations and consequences down the line from the position that I can't see from? So for me, mindfulness is in some ways turning inward. There is a reflection, but also develop a critical imagination. This is where literature comes in, to see well beyond what we could see from our own initial perspective.
The possibility.
Yeah, exactly.
If you don't have a critical imagination and you don't do the critical consciousness, you don't even know what the possibilities might be.
That's right. And you do have to imagine. And I think imagination I mean, there are other earlier thinkers who talk about, the possibilities of imagination and it's creative for sure, but also the critical element of that is really important. In other words, to be able to see, to have some sense of understanding. It doesn't mean that you're in their world or or experiencing what they're experiencing, but there's some possibility of making a connection with the plight of other people. And so whether we call that empathy or compassion, I think both of those terms work well. But that's I think the the everyday work, right?
That's the everyday work.
Yeah.
How do you cultivate your imagination?
I grade student papers. No. Let's see. Well, I like to read. I like to think. In fact, this too for me, whether I'm talking to you or I think most of my engagement, like I love my classrooms too. I feel like sometimes they're a free-for-all, and we start with a skeletal agenda of where we want to go for that day, and sometimes we just throw it out the window. And then students begin to say, hey, let's talk about this, or they see connections that I didn't see before, and we go from there. And so for me, that's an occasion for the critical imagination to work. And so rather than to stifle that, to say, well, we've got to cover this because this is going to be on the exam, let's see where thinking takes us that day. As I tell my students, I'm always looking for other intellectual interlocutors. I mean, that's where most of our learning, I think, takes place. That's how we begin to think about, what others are engaged in, what they're thinking about, and and also what happens in that space of connection. So how do we, what new possibilities, what other kinds of imaginary or imaginative potential exist in the meeting with another person, so for people, yeah.
What are you hopeful about?
Well, I am hopeful about, I don't mean this to be cliche, about the students I'm working with right now across the board. I think that historically they are facing challenges, and I mentioned this before, that I know that human history is full of extraordinary challenges and seemingly difficult, if not impossible, situations. But I have to tell you, to go back to this activist sort of argument again, that there is an awareness, a critical consciousness, I think, broadly with them and in them, and that they participate in and produce every day, right? And so I am hopeful about that. So there's a lot that we need to work through right now, but they're engaged in it. Yeah.
And how will you continue to cultivate your own humanity?
It's a great question too. I love what I'm doing. I often talk about, even though there are all these problems with higher education in ways that we've talked about in longer conversations that are too nuanced and too in depth to go into this, but I love the university, and I think that for me it opened up worlds that I wouldn't have had without it. So there is a utopian element to the university that I still believe in. And utopian in the sense that, that word it's a combined word. It means no place, as we sometimes hear before, and good place, both of those together. And so we have to understand both its negation and also the awesome potential that it has. And so, so I try to change my work in the university. I feel like I'm trying to change the university for the better. We'll see if it works out that way, but that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Yeah, the imagination. Perhaps we can imagine a post-colonial project called the University of not only the University of the Pacific, but all higher education.
Exactly, the very institution of higher education.
Can you imagine a post-colonial project?
Yeah.
What might that look like? What might that feel like? And how will you know it is?
Yeah.
How will we know?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of work to do to get there. I'm thinking about meritocracy again, those who don't have access to higher education, and even the way in which the entire education system now is still privileging just actually fewer and fewer people right, as we go. So, yeah, but I think that if we don't think about that, Mary, I feel like our work is for naught then, right? So, yeah. And I like the way that you put it in terms of the question of, again, this is a critical imagination. We have to have a sense of what would that look like? What would that look like? What if we get this right? I think is your question.
That's my
right?
Yeah.
What if we get this right?
There's a new book that's coming out. The author, her name escapes me right now, but that is going to be the name of her book. And I think she's a climate person that studies it. But what if we get this right.
Yeah.
That's about aspiration.
Yeah, it is, right.
That's actually, it's about swagger.
Yeah.
About showing up, believing that you can do it. It's about boldness.
Yeah.
It's a little verve.
It is, I think so. And on the opposite side of that, it's not cynicism.
It's not
cynicism. And I think that's the other side of this too, why we do what we do, is that I think this is a world that is sort of fraught with cynicism from politics, but even those who just don't see the possibilities, that may not have the critical imagination, and so or just want to be, or just reduce everything to sheer consumerism, right? Or capitalist extraction. But I think that's exactly, what if we get this right, is in some ways a critical, radical, calling into question of that cynicism.
Absolutely. And we're going to do it by institutionalizing belonging, institutionalizing hope, and institutionalizing love.
Yeah. Yeah. Cheers to that.
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that.
Thank you so much for being in the studio here at the University of the Pacific's beautiful Stockton campus here at our lovely Holt Library.
Yeah.
You and I got a lot of work to do.
I feel like we're just getting started.
We're just getting started.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to see what we have coming up this semester, this year, and the years to come.
Likewise.
Thank you so much, Professor Jeffrey Hull, Professor of English.
Thank you for having me, Mary. So this has been, fun. Again, I feel like we're just at the beginning of this, and so let's plan for more.
Let's plan for more.
All right, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.